The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I am Tylor, and as always, I am joined by Greg, and today we're going to be talking about two chapters. That's Chapter 16, The Wisdom, and Chapter 17, Watchers and Hunters. But before we dive into the recap, Greg, I just wanted to get big overall impressions. How are you feeling about where we're at in the story and how things seem to be progressing?
I mean, I was just looking. I don't have an e-reader. I'm reading the paperback, but we did pass a third of the way through now, I believe. We're closing in on 300, and my edition at least is like 850. So I'm feeling good. And you know, I think we talked last time. It feels like that part of a roller coaster where you're right up at the top and you're still hearing that kind of click, 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 and you know one of those clicks is going to be the last one, but I still don't think we've quite heard that last click. So I'm excited to see where this is going and where we're at. I'm feeling good. I'm liking this a lot. I texted you in between episodes. You're like, when do you want to go? I'm like, well, I'm reading right away because I now, it used to be I would read at the last minute, and now it's like, no, I read right away and then look forward to the discussion. So yeah. And you're feeling good. You haven't walked away from your fandom this read through.
Yeah, it turns out when you read the books the fifth time, it doesn't really change how much you like them. That being said, I think I've mentioned this off podcast once or twice, and I think once maybe on the podcast as well. The first half of the Eye of the World is honestly not my favorite Wheel of Time. So I'm actually just kind of counting down. We're a few episodes from when I am really excited to be diving into things. So I think you're right to be identifying we're just a couple clicks away from the fun part of the roller coaster. That being said, why don't we just dive into Chapter 16, The Wisdom? So Chapter 16 begins with the boys and Tom arriving back at the inn. And before they're able to go in and confront Nynaeve, Min pulls Rand aside. We get a wonderful exchange where Tom says, "We don't have time for that." And Min's response, "Go juggle something," made me laugh more than I remember in this book. We then get the interaction between Nynaeve and Moiraine, and it's clear that they've basically been having a stare down in this room, and that Nynaeve has been demanding to see all of the Emond's fielders and make sure that they're okay. Once the group arrives, they have a brief discussion about what the plan is going forward. We get some interesting interactions between Nynaeve and Lan and Moiraine that kind of lay out the tension between all of those characters, and eventually we don't really get much of a resolution to that situation. The boys and Egwene and Tom leave the room, and we don't really see what ends up being discussed between Moiraine and Nynaeve at all. Eventually, we do get a brief discussion between Rand and Nynaeve, where they're basically talking about how Rand has grown up, how he seems to be growing into wearing a sword and dealing with these situations that have never been faced before. And finally, we get an interesting thing that happened sometime during the interaction we didn't see. We find out that one of the key things that Moiraine was asking Nynaeve was whether any of the boys were born outside of the two rivers. And we both learned that Nynaeve did not reveal to Moiraine that Rand was born outside the two rivers, but we also learned that Nynaeve did know about Rand potentially not being Tam's child, or at least having been born away, and she always assumed he was Carrie's child. That's Rand's mother's name, I believe we learned for the first time in this chapter. The other interesting detail that I had actually never picked up on before, as we kind of end the chapter description, is that it turns out Carrie Althor did have red hair. I had always assumed that Rand's red hair was an aberration. It does actually fit with the woman who he spent most of his life believing was his mother. That's an interesting detail I hadn't caught before. So if that's something I'm picking up on, I'm curious for you as someone the first time going through this, what were kind of the key things that you keyed in on in this section or that you thought were the most interesting details?
Yeah, so I think I ended last episode being like, what? How did she get here? Why is she here? And that totally made me suspicious. And it kind of fits this pattern where something suspicious happens or somebody does something unexpected and you're like, oh, the next chapter, it's hitting the fan, it's going nuts. And then it's just like, it kind of fizzles. And I don't necessarily mean that in an unsatisfying way, but this isn't a book that concentrates on like people shouting at each other a lot, or at least so far. So it is, of course, like I'm like picking up ready to get like, oh, what's happening now? And it's like, oh, a small private conversation where they settle out what their different motivations are and come to a path of mutual agreement. So yeah, and so I thought it was certainly not what I expected, because I hadn't picked up on that pattern. And you know, if I entered the chapter really suspicious of Nynaeve, it's not like I really felt that confirmed, right? It was kind of then like, oh, you know, she's the equivalent of the mom who is worried about the kids and just wanted to check back in and see what had happened to them. And then when I'm piecing through like, oh, right, they were just there was a big disruption in the village and then they just left with a stranger, of course, you know, there'd be some questions for that. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think to me, what's really interesting about this section is that it both gives us kind of a very reasonable, kind of like you said, Nynaeve justifies herself being there. The story she tells really fits. And it also kind of gives us some interesting details about what's going on in the two rivers in the week or so since the winter night, and we had the Trollocs and all of the terrible things going on there. And I thought this was a really interesting section, both because it gave us a little bit more of like the gender dynamics and politics of the two rivers, things that had been hinted at before, but we really didn't get into too much. But I also thought it was really interesting in this section just to see how Rand was piecing things together in addition to what we're hearing from Nynaeve and Moiraine, because we actually at the end of the chapter get Nynaeve saying, Rand, I can't believe you picked up on all of this. And you know, for us who have been in Rand's head, it's like, no, he's been up on this the whole time. And so this, I think, is a really interesting kind of character moment to see how people are perceiving Rand versus how he's perceiving the situation.
Yeah, and I think you're right to point that out, that because we are participants in his interiority, we forget that that is not shared with everybody. And in the next chapter, there's this funny thing where he keeps being like, whoa, and Egwene isn't talking to me like every time. And it's like, yeah, but you're not talking to her either. Yeah. You know, again, you're having this rich interior life and you're not sharing that. Yeah, and part of what you said, I was thinking a lot about Joseph Campbell, who, for better or worse, shapes almost all of our modern storytelling because, you know, George Lucas and a bunch of other creators kind of followed his pattern. He has a stage in the hero's journey that is generally called the refusal of the call, right? Where the hero is invited on some grand adventure to step out of the everyday life. And then there's a moment where the hero refuses that call because, as Campbell puts it, that the concerns of the everyday outweigh the concerns of like the larger world, right? So this is Luke Skywalker saying like, no, I got to do my chores. I can take you as far as Anchorhead, but that's as far as I can go. Or, you know, it sometimes is also like Harry Potter. His uncle refuses the call. He hides the letters and keeps, you know, to comedic effect. And so I was thinking about that language of the world of the everyday, of the commonplace, those concerns overwhelming the need to go to the strange heroic realm. And this was like a weird inversion of that because the hero Rand presumably has, you know, taken those steps and agreed to go on the adventure. And here come the concerns of Two Rivers kind of coming back to call him back. Now, that's not to say Rand is then tempted, but it's that continued concern like, he's like reminded, like, oh, my dad, right? Like, how is my dad? Like, is he recovering? And how are the sheep? And what is the town council doing? And all these things. Though that language of like the concerns of the everyday, it's like, oh, right, that goes on, right? And that's the hero's burden, is they are going to go off and have their adventure, but the final stage of Campbell's monomyth is to become the master of both worlds, right? And a lot of I'm thinking now, jumping to Lord of the Rings, the part of Lord of the Rings they cut out of the films is when the hobbits get back and they have to have a battle to become masters of Hobbiton again, right?
The cleansing of the Shire, my favorite part of those books.
Yeah, and like, I get it, that movie is way too long as it is, and they need to trim stuff out, but that's such an important stage, that the hero is not a hero just by slaying the dragon. They also have to prove themselves to be the master of home as well. And so I think, again, I don't want to project way far out here and give myself another losing prediction, but I do think that it's significant that we're getting a reminder that Two Rivers continues to exist and will continue to have things change. They are perhaps not at the center of this story, but even at the periphery, the effects are going to be felt. Now I'll stop this ramble by saying, then to know, probably the most compelling part of this to me is that Min sees what she calls sparks around Nynaeve. And as I understood it, she has only seen those sparks when 3 or 4 of the party are together at once. It's kind of like supercharged, sparks of destiny or something. And so here we have, when she witnessed just Nynaeve, she's getting sparks with just Moiraine and Nynaeve are 2 people. And so to me, we're being signaled like, oh, actually, you thought this character we left behind didn't matter, but they are, more important to this story than perhaps some of our other participants so far. So that was really compelling to me as well. Prediction right or wrong, that was compelling.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually the vision that Min described, I think a couple of chapters ago, it was not just these sparks, it was an image of sparks that were fighting off shadow and shadow that was trying to swallow sparks. And so not only the fact that when 2 of them are together, it immediately becomes visible instead of requiring more of them, but also the fact that she's emphasizing the sparks rather than the shadow is maybe a sign Nynaeve is really important to what's going on here, and kind of what Moiraine has repeatedly called the pattern, which we'll figure out what that metaphor means someday in this series. But I think that's really kind of useful and interesting. And it's something that I think Robert Jordan does really effectively, is he highlights for you what characters are really important by giving you these intriguing details that make you think, what are they going to be doing in 3, 4, 5 books? But also, just in response to what you were saying about kind of the hero's journey sort of thing, one thing that I really thought was interesting about this chapter is, as you're describing kind of the refusal and, how do we manage this in terms of like the hero's journey, I thought it was really interesting. To some degree, we've already seen Rand go through this stage, right? When Tam is injured, he initially basically says like, well, we're going to be doing this for a week. Like, we're just, farmers, we can't possibly do it. And so part of what's interesting to me, if we're putting this story in kind of that Campbell superstructure, is to say that to some degree what we're seeing in this chapter is Nynaeve's refusal, or maybe some other characters, even though the person whose head we've been in already has gone through this. And so the idea, I think Robert Jordan is already kind of saying there are multiple heroes. We're going to get this, kind of monotype story, but not just told for one person, for a variety of the characters in kind of our fellowship that we've assembled.
Yeah, and that lends itself well to, again, I'm kind of assuming we're all together and then we'll break the fellowship and we will have different strands with different characters. Again, that might be wrong, but that seems how a lot of these books or fantasy series tend to be structured. And so it really helps that they all adhere to that type of journey. My favorite not scholar on Joseph Campbell is Dan Harmon, creator of Community and Rick and Morty and everything good on the internet. And what he talks about as the kind of, if you think of the hero's journey as a clock, the refusal of the call is like 2 o'clock, and then the crossing of the threshold is 3, which would be in Rand's journey when he got when he left Two Rivers. That next stage, so kind of 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock is the road of trials, and he uses a metaphor which I've always loved, which is digestion, right? That this is the moment where the hero is getting digested, meaning broken down to their core elements, and that road of trials is supposed to be test after test after test, and the hero learns different things both about the world and about themselves. And the key to good storytelling is that it always has to be both, right? That you know, in a video game you learn that XXY swings your sword or whatever, like that's the combo, but you additionally, as the hero learns how to do those things, has to be learning more about themselves and what they value and what really means you know, makes up who they are. And in that way, then we continue on Rand's journey with Nynaeve being some kind of helper figure. Again, I think at least I had written her off like, yep, she's gone, end of that story. And to have her come back and play a role in kind of sleuthing out his backstory, I think is going to be important, right? Because we're breaking Rand down and discovering who he really is. Now, to that point, it was really intriguing to me again that we get a warning: don't trust Moiraine. Like, do not trust her. You are all in danger, I think is what Nynaeve says. And I was kind of gauging my own reaction. And basically every time somebody warns us off, and it's been so many warnings about like, don't trust her, she's not to be trusted, I never believe them. And I think the accumulation of more and more warnings makes me think, nope, this is the crazy old wizard you're supposed to follow, and you need to continue on this journey. And you know, I think we joked last episode that I was like, yeah, let's believe the shadow, let's believe Baerlon. So it's like, you know, I continue to question my own kind of gut. Am I right? Is this, you know, a familiar type, the person dismissed by society, although she's not quite that? Or should we really be as skeptical as literally everybody outside of Rand is of her? Maybe outside of Rand and Lan. So,
yeah, I mean, to me, I've always kind of, when I was reading these books the first time and didn't quite know who Moiraine was or where she fit, I don't know whether she exactly fits an archetype, but she fits a type of character that I'm familiar with seeing in the real world, right? Which is the person who has an objective and they truly believe that their objective is the most important thing. It's, you know, the only thing that matters to them, and they will do whatever it takes to achieve their goal, right? And we've gotten this a lot of times with Moiraine over and over again. She sunk the ferry. She was willing to say, Matt, I'll just kill you if you try to run off. And then in the next chapter, she writes off Master Fitch's inn being burned down, right? And so to me, the tension with Moiraine is not necessarily good guy, bad guy, because I, like you, kind of just immediately bought into like Tam trusts her, Rand seems to trust her. No matter how many people tell me not to, I'm kind of going to believe she's a good person until she stops killing Trollocs. But she's the kind of good person who I don't trust in spite of believing she's a good person, right? She seems like the kind of person who would sell out the party in order to achieve her goal. You know, if we're putting this in like Dungeons and Dragon-y kind of thing, like she's not a lawful good character where you can trust she's going to follow the law. She's not a chaotic good character where you can trust she's always going to defy stereotypes and do whatever. She's neutral good. She will do what she believes is good, and if that means following the rules, it'll involve following the rules, and if that means destroying everything, she'll destroy everything. And so I kind of see her less along the like good bad scale, or at least the first time I read it I did, and a little bit more on that like
that's intriguing right there. Oops yeah sorry, go ahead.
I'm just gonna start throwing in red herrings now. This is what I need to do, obviously. But that to me is the more interesting question for Moiraine, because I don't think we have the data we need for good or bad, but we have a lot of data on is willing to do things that others might consider evil for what she believes is good.
Yes. And I am gonna forget whether this was the current chapter or the one we're about to discuss. But I think there was a segment here where she kind of alludes to the fact that this is a very small part of a very big, complex system. And some of her actions may end up looking wrong, but she is so much more concerned about, the larger game going on, right? I mean, I think we were making chess analogies before. She's playing three-dimensional chess. Everybody else can only see the one board, and she's going to keep those pieces in play. And I would say the only other part as you were talking, I was thinking like, I do trust her as far as getting them to Tarvalon, right? Like that's to me is part of that she's agreed to go this far, and then her goals are going to supersede theirs, and off she goes, or I don't trust her to take care of them forever, right? Yeah. Because we're referencing whatever random shit we can. Sorry, I don't want to get that explicit label. It makes me think
like an R-rated movie, one an episode.
One, there it is. The movie that comes to mind is A League of Their Own, which is just like the best sports movie of all time. But
Field of Dreams, but okay.
Oh, okay, fair. What I always love is when the scout gets them to the tryouts, and they're like, "You're not coming with us," and he's like, "No, like that's not my job." And it's so funny to me, but that very much feels like this relationship. It's like, yeah, I get you to the tryouts, and then you go play baseball, right? Like I'll get you to Tarvalon, and then you have to deal with the rest of this. I'll go home and give my wife the old pickle tickle, I think is what he says. And he moves on with his life because he's not the mentor figure in that story. And I'm sure you can do a Campbellian reading of it as well. But we'll save that for our next podcast project, I think.
Yeah, we're going to have to fight about sports movies off of this podcast. But actually, while we're kind of talking about this confrontation between, what in the next chapter becomes kind of a moral conflict between Nynaeve and Moiraine, I was interested in the interaction we see in this scene between Nynaeve and another character, because there's a good bit of time devoted to Nynaeve and Lan, where initially she seems to be hesitant about taking anything from him, and then they have the interaction about how did she track them down. She reveals that she's such a good tracker, and he seems legitimately impressed. She starts blushing into her wine cup. There's some interesting kind of interpersonal stuff going on there. I was curious how much you read into that, or kind of what you picked up on in that interaction between those two characters.
Well, I think my questioning in those interactions came down to, is this a part of her power set? Because I don't really still fully understand the wisdom as a role. I mean, it seems primarily to be almost like a bureaucratic role instead of like anything with a power set. But in some ways, when she's revealing she has like a supernatural ability to track, I mean, she says like, my dad taught me, don't worry about it. And that didn't feel ultimately fulfilling. And it's like, well, it doesn't seem like this is a character we'd expect to have this skill, despite living in a rural area and probably needs to do some tracking. But Lan's response is also kind of equally, what's the internet phrase is like game recognized game. He's like, oh, touche. Like I did my best and you saw through it. And so I don't know, could that be a budding romance? I'm going to go ship them. No, I don't think so. But what would Lenave would be the couple name, I guess.
I like Lenave. That's nice.
Lenave. That sounds like you're like trying to like say a knave in French or something. Lenave. So yeah, I think that was my main reaction. Like, okay, she's got some skills here. If she, I mean, again, she seems to be going to continue on this journey with them. It seems to me that as this party grows, each of them almost needs their own class, going back to Dungeons and Dragons, so that we have a full party with a good ability set for whatever we come up across.
And actually, I like that Dungeons and Dragons metaphor, because as you've been saying, you aren't quite, completely clear on where like the wisdom fits. I think the information we've got so far is in Dungeons and Dragons land. It's a druid, right? It's nature knowledge. Yep. It's the ability to use plants for healing. There is a leadership component, and apparently tracking, at least for Nynaeve, also seems to be a part of the story.
Yeah, and that would be a rogue, right? So kind of rogue druid type thing. Look at I'm living for the approval of my dungeon master right now. Like I see him nod on Zoom and I'm like, yes, I'm the A student who has somehow remembered like 3 facts in 4 years or something like that.
In our group, that's kind of impressive.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So in that regard, I vetoed off air. I vetoed a discussion of the chapter symbol, but the chapter symbol for this chapter 16 is a very kind of druid like thing. The trifoil leaves, and we'll return to discuss that at a future moment when we know a little bit more about it. But that totally fits with that. And then, again, I think the last piece would be this discussion where Nynaeve is in on the secret, and Rand finally reveals to somebody else what his father said, right? That's that discussion.
Yes.
And she is like, well, people say things when they have fevers, but then offers a super vague, like, well, your dad went with an outsider or left and came home with an outsider. I just assumed it was your mom. And like you said, they shared their red hair. So it immediately was easy to poke holes in that. I continue to feel a little bit like Loki, right? Like, I guess Game of Thrones ended up having a story kind of like that as well, where it's like, well, there's this orphan child, and for whatever reason, we're going to pretend it's ours, and that is my ongoing assumption, and that Rand will just very slowly come about to know what the circumstances of his father finding him are. And now that Two Rivers is kind of in the picture, that seems like that could eventually lead to a confrontation or just a discussion between them more than anything. And that's exciting to me, that we haven't necessarily left all of that world behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting. Like you said, this is the first time that Rand has told anyone, including his father, what Tam said. But then also, I think what's interesting to me is not just the dynamic between the two of them figuring out who knows what and who's being told what, but the kind of impetus for this whole conversation is really interesting to me, which is, why does Moiraine care whether any of the boys were born outside of the Two Rivers, right? Because so far, the story that we've gotten is that the reason that Rand, Mat, and Perrin seem to be really important is because of when they were born, right? We find out that they were all born within days of one another, and that even boys who were like a few months older or a few months younger weren't lumped together with them in that same age bracket. And so the fact that Moiraine is not just looking for someone of a very specific age, but is also looking for someone who was born outside of the Two Rivers, I think is really interesting, because it gives us a little bit more of, we were discussing before, we don't really quite know what Moraine's motivations are, but we're starting to see just little pieces of what she seems to be seeking or why she thinks these boys are particularly important. And it does seem to be kind of tied up in this mystery around who are Rand's parents.
Yeah. And yeah, I've mentioned this before. It does feel like Harry Potter to me, those kind of late book revelations about Voldemort knew it would be a child and ends up marking he ends up choosing Harry over Neville, that it could have been either of the two boys, and he ended up marking his own enemy. And then again, thinking about the theme of this, that this is a wheel in a rotation, right? Then it would seem that one of the powers of the Aes Sedai could be to kind of be experts on the way the story went last time. And so piecing together those bits, it's like, okay, we know these are targeted. We're going to get that. That seems to me to be a part of that. And I would fit Min into that picture as well, because if we understand that all this has happened before and all this will happen again, then what Min is doing may just be looking at the previous rotation or across the current wheel, or what have you, choose your metaphor. And so it seems to me that this all again amounts to, this is all preordained. There's whether it's the pattern we had referenced here, or there is a structure that is expected, and the smartest among us seem to be able to understand the current moment in the context. And again, that would include Baal-Zaman, flipping backwards in my notes quickly, as somebody who knows the game, knows the structure. So I guess that would sum up my main takeaway from this chapter. It's like, yep, there are a lot of people who know a lot of this structure, and we're just going to keep getting it piecemeal around these kind of plot bits.
Yet two quick notes just about what you're saying. Number one, I think, when you talk about Min in the context of kind of knowing the pattern and what's going on, in fact, she said that Moiraine calls what Min does seeing fragments of the pattern. So it's definitely something around kind of the wheel and what's flowing there. The other thing that I was going to mention just briefly in regards to this is when you were talking about Baelzamon, we were kind of talking about Rand's parentage and why would someone take him in and what have you. One of the things that Baelzamon said to Rand was that his parents were chosen by Aes Sedai. And so I think that's really interesting context here as we're thinking about how trustworthy is Moiraine. Baelzamon is telling us if she's looking for someone who was born outside the Two Rivers, it may actually be because she's looking for someone whose birth was planned or was ordained in some way. And so that's, just an interesting piece to layer on top of everything else we've got in that debate.
And again, I think it's only slightly frustrating that Rand's not putting those pieces together because, again, he saw everything in the vision and was like, oh, that's not true. My parents are from Two Rivers, and yet is working the other side of that mystery and not just being like, oh, right, these would change each other if I consider them at the same moment. So, and I don't mean frustrating in like, I want to throw the book across the room, but in a good way where you're like, I want my characters to figure this out and we're going to build this, understanding. You always want it at page 325 instead of 825, but that's how these books work.
If you don't want to throw a Wheel of Time book across the room at least once throughout the course of the book, you're doing something wrong. Like, these characters don't talk to each other well enough for you to not be frustrated occasionally. Was there anything else in chapter 16 that jumped out at you? I think that was all the things I had in my notes.
Looks like we've checked everything off on my list. Yeah, I say let's move on to Watchers and Hunters. Let's go to a dance party.
Absolutely. So Watchers and Hunter, as you said, begins with Tom telling the story of the great hunt for the horn. It's actually the same story that he was telling the previous day, but people are completely engrossed. Once he gets tired of storytelling, he and a couple of other people start playing some music. Everyone starts dancing, and Rand has a number of interesting encounters dancing with Moiraine, Nynaeve, Egwene, a particularly forward serving girl, and a variety of other people. But while he's dancing, he does notice that there's an individual in the crowd who has a large scar who seems to be staring at them. And then later on in the chapter, we also learn that he's been staring at both Mat and Perrin. They both noticed him, and that's going on. Eventually, kind of the dancing ends for the evening, and Rand says, hey, I'm going to go get some milk, and then is immediately confronted by a merge rail, or a fade, as he's repeatedly referred to in this chapter. We get our first description of the fade's eyeless face. It's horrifying. But interestingly, the Fade draws a weapon, threatens Rand, and then leaves before doing any damage. Lan arrives, immediately realizes what is going on, and says, we are leaving now. The group makes their way out of the inn. Moiraine tries to convince the innkeeper to really take this seriously and maybe like go into hiding or just like deny that they were there. Master Finch doesn't seem to take them very seriously. Once the group gets their horses, Rand is suspicious of a number of people who are gathering the horses, but eventually they make their way out towards the gate. Lan is able to bribe some guards to get them to start opening the gate, but as they do, 5 white cloaks begin to confront them, among them Dane Bornhald, the white cloak who earlier confronted Rand after Mat knocked over all of the barrels. They believe that anyone who is leaving town in the darkness must be evil, and once they recognize Rand, they are extra convinced that everyone is evil. And then Moiraine gets really big and scary and shrouded in shadows, and everyone runs away. And then she gets back to the group and is like, nah, you were just seeing things. And then the group basically makes their way out of the city. They camp out for the evening. And as we mentioned before, they have the big argument when they realize Master Fitch's inn is on fire. And Moiraine basically says, there's nothing we can do. If we go back, all is lost. Everyone else, the Two Rivers folks, are arguing about, is this the right thing? Should we help them? What can we do? What should we do? And this is another moment where Moiraine just says, no, my goal supersedes everything else, and they move on. So we were talking last week about kind of the city of Baerlon being a powder keg that's ready to blow. And I think it's very interesting that we leave the city right as that fuse is basically being lit. So I'm curious, that obviously subverted some of your expectations. How did you feel about us once again, as you said before, kind of fizzling out the action right at the moment where everything could have exploded?
Well, I mean, I think it definitely is. It reveals that conflict at the end of the chapter, which is, for better or worse, they are cutting a path of destruction across this countryside, right? That brings to mind like Sherman's march across Georgia or something, but it's not vindictive, but like you start to understand why people don't like the Aes Sedai, right? And why people are suspicious of people like Moiraine. And it's because, they are like, they were here and now are burned down. They were here and now there were Trollocs and then they're just gone. And so certainly the reputation in each of these little towns would be, they're terrible. Don't let them come here or protect us from them. I think, I don't even know if I've revealed this on the podcast. I am from an exceedingly small town. I always joke we have one traffic light and it's the kind that just blinks. It's not actually a signal light. So I grew up in a town of, when I was there, probably like 750 to 1,000 people. And so a lot of the dynamics we're seeing, actually last chapter and this chapter, are very familiar. And it's like, this is how somebody becomes a pariah in town, right? It's just a couple of these bad interactions. And then that's the person where everybody's like, well, and so like, it totally fits with that conversation we were having. And then again, just to reinforce what we said last chapter, but it's not like Moiraine in the end conversation has an answer for everything, and that should lead me to be suspicious of her, but I'm still like, nope, makes sense. Like, you guys just don't understand that she has to do this and she has to make those decisions as a part of who she is. So that was kind of a jump all over the place type of answer, but like, those were some of my impressions. I will say it wasn't disappointment. Like it's like, we talked about before that we missed the raid on Two Rivers. We just got the aftermath, and here it's, I guess, basically the opposite. We know it's happening, but we're not going to keep the camera focused on it. Seems hard to adapt for television. That would be frustrating to a lot of people, I think. But it's good for me.
Well, let me just say, they didn't adapt it for television. Baerlon is not in the show at all.
Interesting.
All of the things that happen in Baerlon happen basically at some point somewhere else on the television show. But this entire thing, they didn't put it on TV. The other thing that I thought, kind of as you were talking through this, that I thought was really interesting is this question of, you said, you just kind of buy Moiraine. She has all the answers that should make us suspicious, but she does a pretty good job of justifying everything. What really keyed to me on this is, I go, no, I'm not suspicious of Moiraine's motives. I'm not suspicious of whether she's doing the wrong thing and telling us she's doing the right thing. What I do get suspicious of is what she's actually trying to achieve, and why she views it as so much more valuable than this entire swath of destruction she's leaving behind her. Because to this point, we know she's protecting these boys for some reason we're unaware of, and that's kind of all we've got. So to me, the mystery around her motivation is kind of what exists, even though I agree with you. I for some reason, I just buy into her saying, here's the answer, we're done. And maybe it's just because I'm like a utilitarian nightmare, just like Moiraine. I'm like, yep, greatest good for the greatest number. But, I kind of buy it.
Right. I think the two options in my mind were, she's callous and just doesn't care, which happens to that type of character, right? They are so concerned with the forest that they forget that the trees actually do matter as well. Or they are all naive to think that amount of suffering could matter in the grand scheme of things, that Moiraine has to do what she's doing to prevent such suffering of such grand extent that she can't care about it. But I mean, so why I lean to the second of those two options is, she does say like, well, right, I'm gonna have somebody send some gold. And that was a moment where like I totally bought it, right? And it's like, okay, yeah, she's actually gonna do that. She's gonna figure out what the inn was worth, what she missed, and send it. And there was an allusion to that around the ferry as well. Like, they'll take care of these people. So while you still could call that callous, or that they are making decisions and taking away people's agency in some ways. To me, it's like, well, if you make sure to minimize the suffering, then sure, right? Let that person get a cut, address the wound, or not dress the wound, and then move on. And it's like, maybe there's a better world where nobody gets cut, but if you have to make choices, that seems like the kindest way to do so. So to pick up on your strict utilitarian, it's like, well, yeah, but then they're not just saying like, well, that person suffers and we don't. We also make sure, right, that it's the trolley problem. but while we're going to let the trolley hit one person, then we're going to also rush them to the hospital or what have you. Yeah.
Well, and I think we've identified why I never distrusted Moiraine as someone with a PhD in economics, the person who's like, don't worry, I'll pay for it. I'm like, yeah, problem solved. Money is all that matters. All of this is actually kind of later section of the chapter discussion. You started by saying this chapter is kind of a dance party. I'm curious what you thought of the dance party, because I have very minimal notes on that, despite the fact that it is probably a good like third, almost a half of the chapter.
I mean, based off of what conversation we just came out of, my main note here is just, it seems so frivolous. It's like you all just talked about how high the stakes are, and now and like when it's the two rivers, you're like, oh, all right, they're simpletons or whatever, and then you're like, oh no, it's all of them, including Moiraine. And it's like, I was just listening to a really good podcast this morning with it was Bill Hader was guest starring on Brett Goldstein's podcast. I'm just name dropping like these are my friends, but these are a podcast I was listening to. It was really good. But Bill Hader related a kind of metaphor for life, which is imagining a sky dancer, somebody who jumps out of an airplane and does like the most amazing choreography and moves. Halfway down, realizes the parachute is broken and it doesn't open. So the sky dancer just continues to dance and dances all the way down to impact, right? And so that came to mind with this chapter, because it's like, what are you protecting in this life if not the ability for a small group of townspeople to dance, right? And there's a little of that in Lord of the Rings too. It's like the hobbits were protecting this, and at the end, the other hobbits had no idea what the four heroes went through, but that was the reason they did it, so that these people could pick pumpkins and drink ale and so on. So I think I was of two minds. In other words, it's like, yeah, like, why are you dancing? But also like, yeah, dance. That's all we got. I still think I'm going to keep bothering you. You haven't seen my favorite movie of 2022, which is Everything Everywhere All at Once.
I have not, sorry.
Which is fantastic, and I won't spoil it, but one of the themes in that movie is nothing matters, so everything matters kind of message. And I think that feels here, right? Life is fleeting. And if we're going to work to end suffering for everybody, that means we have to enjoy some of our lives too. That being said, the like speed datey square dance thing, that totally sounded familiar to me. And I hate those things. Yeah, I got dragged into one of those at a festival in my hometown, and like it was a mixed age crowd, and so the people I kept getting paired up with were like my friends' moms, and they're like stoked because they're like, little Greg, here he is, he's grown up, and like we're gonna, and again, we're just gonna link arms and do-si-do or whatever. And I'm just like, kill me now. I don't want to do any of that. So I was totally Rand in those moments too. I'm like, yep, I try not to dance at weddings. I feel that everybody is constantly judging me, even though the beauty of a crowded dance is that nobody's judging you, but everybody's kind of judging you anyway.
Well, the moment that a dance tells me what to do, right? If the singer says like right foot, whatever, I'm out, right? And that's what square dancing is. Everyone's doing exactly the same dancing at exactly the same time. I have to say, part of the reason that I struggle with this section is because I have always, and this is kind of a staple of fantasy literature, I struggle with song lyrics. In particular, I struggle with Robert Jordan's song song lyrics, because Robert Jordan's song lyrics don't have the same number of syllables per line. And it makes me so upset every time, because I try to find a rhythm in my head that makes the song work. And in, The Wind That Shakes the Willows, I think is the song that we got written out. Like the first 4 lines are 8 syllables per line, and then the next 4 lines are 7 syllables per line. And I hate him for it so much. So I
not a poet, not a poet, in other words, the scansion fails. Yeah. And so I actually feel much the same way. If I'm completely honest, those are also times my eyes skip down. Like when you see like 5 blocks of song, I'm like, this doesn't matter, and I skip it. And I think that does a disservice to a lot of fantasy literature. But the other book series I'm reading has a bunch of songs too. I'm like, I don't care. And I always think it's really interesting. The Hobbit movies struggled with this more than Lord of the Rings, where it's like in the Hobbit, those are really like intricate songs and important. And the animated films from the 80s did such a good job incorporating them to at least to the eyes of the children who watched those movies and were traumatized by them. Then it's like, we're just gonna skip them or gonna have it a little bit. And they're tough. Before we leave that piece behind, I would say I was intrigued by The Great Hunt, because that is, again, there's emphasis on he's telling the story again, but nobody cares because he basically works different tangents on it, and different figures and different people. And there's a list of a few names and allusions to that. And that to me was also kind of a flag moment of wheel stuff, because I did peek at the back cover of my book, and I see that book 2 is called The Great Hunt,
which I told you in the last episode.
Yeah, but I waited long enough that I felt like it was my own revelation, so that's fine. So when it's like, okay, that now I want to kind of see what details, and I want to start casting if that's the last turn of the wheel, then who in our current party is this person and that person and this person. So I started playing that game, and if it were to come up again, I think that's the game I would be playing about this, as it were. The Spy gets dismissed way too fast for them not to be important. I alluded last time to the Lord of the Rings line. The enemy would servants of the enemies would look fairer and feel fouler, right? So that continues to be my mindset, that you should be suspicious of whoever looks good and welcome whoever doesn't. So this is a scarred person, so I'm like, well, again, somebody's society is outcast. I believe the innkeeper just says he's a spy for the White Cloaks. So so that's why he's taking such an interest in you guys. Don't worry about it. And I'm like, nope, he's something bigger. And my money would be on a positive figure, a figure of the light, very much like Aragorn staring at Frodo across the tavern. So I think that's all I had for him. I just said question mark on the spy claim.
Yeah, I think the only thing to me that jumps out about the spy being a White Cloak spy is that the White Cloaks we've kind of seen a few times are kind of obsessed with Aes Sedai, right? When Moiraine and the others arrive in town, immediately, Master Fitch says, like, don't worry about the White Cloaks. There's no Aes Sedai here. They're not going to be able to do anything. And so the fact that a White Cloak spy was staring at a bunch of 18-year-old boys instead of the women in the room who might potentially be Aes Sedai, I think does kind of just ring a couple alarm bells. Something odd is going on there. Even if he is a White Cloak spy, he's clearly not focusing on the things that the White Cloaks might otherwise want their spies really to be keying in on.
Well, and the naive kind of return shows that this party isn't as clever as it thinks it is, or perhaps I should focus that on Lan isn't as clever as he thinks he is. So it seems to me this figure is going to follow, and is prepared to do so, and will probably not be detected until a plot beat when he saves them or something such in a few chapters. I mean, I actually don't have a lot to say about the Fade, really. It's like, again, it's like we just got to keep moving. And as soon as it's like the cop who's like, I'm 2 weeks from retirement. It's like, I can't wait to get a good night's sleep. It's like, nope, that's not gonna happen anymore. I did really we don't talk as much as we should probably about the language. The language of it melting back into the shadows was really cool.
Beautiful.
And I really enjoyed that. And that idea. And I won't talk about a movie I saw recently related to that because I don't want to spoil things. But there's imagery there that is reminiscent of some other different stories we've certainly participated in.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I had to add with the Fade is just it's very interesting to see how the Fade is threatening but not threatening Rand, right? He repeatedly says like, you belong to the Dark Lord, or you are his, and he draws a sword and then does absolutely nothing, right? Even when we think about the parallels between Fades and the Nazgul we've talked about before, it's very clear, but it's pretty obvious in the Fellowship of the Ring that the Nazgul are there to murder Frodo, right? He gets stabbed at one point, they want to kill him and take the ring. Something very different is going on here, right? This Fade had the opportunity to just like stab, walk away, and didn't. So that to me is the only thing that just like starts me thinking, what's going on here? Why is the Dark One not wanting to kill the boys? He wants to find them for some reason. But other than that, yeah, it's a pretty standard, backed into a corner and then the enemy runs away kind of scene.
Yeah, and so then their flight from the inn, I mean, I made a note, Tom makes me laugh there because he always finds some excuse to go on. I had a group of coworkers for a while where there's the guy who didn't smoke but didn't want the smokers to be alone, right? And it's that kind of, it's like, oh, actually it's raining, why don't I come out and hold the umbrella? And I'll have one. And that kind of attitude, I think, is just kind of immobilizing him. And it's he's probably the member of this crew I'm having the hardest time reading because he seems to shift, but that works for a performer and a gleeman in so many ways. So I think I don't sense that he's doing this to be benevolent, but there's also like, well, he's a storyteller, so he wants to witness the story and understand the story, and then he'll use this to write his next great performance or what have you. But it is just funny where he's like, oh yeah, I guess I'll go to the next town with you, and so on.
Well, and I think what's interesting to me about Tom is that every time we see him described away from Moiraine and Lan and the party, when he's telling stories or when he's whatever, he just seems so like positive and gregarious, and everyone seems to be they love him. And then every time that Tom decides, I'm going to come along with you, the way that he justifies it in every single instance is just in the most like self-serving way possible, right? It's almost like when he's evaluating like, what can I say that will make Moiraine and Lan let me stick around? It's like, oh, they'll believe I don't want to die and make money. So he kind of just keeps saying it, even though in lots of other places we've seen that doesn't really seem to be who he is. He doesn't jump out in any of the other scenes as like a super selfish, potentially, self-centered person, but that's immediately what he goes to every single time they're about to leave and he needs a reason to stick around with them.
Yeah. And I mean, you talked last chapter, like, I know real life people like that. I'm like, yeah, I know real life people like that, care about you, but always make it sound like, no, I'm just in for myself. I ain't in for your rebellion, sweetheart. Right. It's that kind of Han Solo attitude. Yeah. Again, and I would credit Robert Jordan that as we talk about the motivations of all of these figures, it's like, yeah, like these feel like real people and real types. Like he is a good judge of character. And as we've credited before, just keeping things kind of gray and not simple, right? They are all characters that benefit from scrutiny, and that's compelling. That keeps me reading as a part of that. And then you alluded to it in your summary, obviously. So one of her powers is that she can grow, or seemingly project an illusion that she can grow. And I do like, the kind of throwaway line when she's like, "Oh, is that what you thought you saw? Interesting," and just keeps going,
Yeah.
right? Like, I there's a small character beat like that in Force Awakens where Rey saves Finn's life, and she's like, "That was lucky," and like as he describes what happened to him, and it felt like that. Like she's so sure of herself and cocky. She's like, "Yeah, I'm not telling you any of this. Like I'm good, just being myself." So I liked that part of it. Um, it was tense to have
Yeah.
the white cloaks or the light cloaks, excuse me,
No, it's
as
white cloaks.
oh, okay, the white cloaks as they were kind of closing in. I mean, again, I think as we were thinking about the world around us, it felt very much like a guy with a gun showing up, right?
Yep.
Like, oh, these are outside the law and their power is derived from what they do, and the kind of menacing, like, let's take you to one of our camps and ask some questions. All of that felt very unnerving and tense. I don't think I really thought the party was in danger, but to understand that that is a very familiar, specific kind of threat, and one that seems to be growing in power is unsettling.
Yeah, and we haven't really talked too much about the white cloaks because we're still kind of dealing with very kind of vague descriptions and only what Rand is picking up and those sorts of things. But to me, like the modern the metaphor of the white cloaks gets better as time has gone on. Right, they're an extra governmental militia that has very specific beliefs about what is good and what is evil, and they want to enforce those beliefs on people whose governments don't have laws about those things. And that feels kind of accurate of the real world, and it feels kind of scarier than it did when I was 10 or 11 reading about the white cloaks. I was like, yeah, those are the bad guys. But now it's like, oh no, these are people who are out there in the real world. Like I can imagine trying to leave town and having someone like before I get on the train be like, no, we need to talk, and me being freaked out about it. Right. So that's kind of what's happening here. It's a very realistic threat in a way that Trollocs or Dragcar aren't.
Well, and just to allude to it before, there's exactly that same idea. They look fairer, right? They are literally clothed in the garb of the light side, the good guys, but feel fouler. They always feel sinister, and there's no doubt. The boys' interaction with them always is, they never think like, oh, these are good guys, like this is fine, even outside of their hatred of the Aes Sedai. I completely just see these as terrible people, but I mean, yeah, that's a good villain, somebody who thinks they're doing what is right. Just a mustache twirler is no good, but these people who are convinced they are just and doing what is in the best interest of everybody are much more dangerous, I think, in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. And I think as we talk about the white cloaks, we were kind of talking about how the story so far has been setting up a bunch of really big potential conflicts and then kind of leaving them behind, right? This is a story of fleeing so far. I think what's really interesting about that is that we've talked about it as kind of like action fizzling out, but to some degree, it's also just leaving like a trail of landmines where the next time someone comes back through here, we've got pissed off white cloaks, we've got Master Fitch maybe upset, we've got whatever's going on in the Two Rivers. We don't know if there are still Trollocs wherever. Like it feels like we're kind of leaving a trail of potential enemies for the next 14 books or so.
Yeah, or so. I think that's right. And just to jump back to Joseph Campbell, his structure always has the magic return, right? And part of what that is that you spend the majority of your journey going through all these things. And then you're like, no, let's just get on a giant eagle, like Frodo and the Hobbits, or let's click our heels like Dorothy and go home. And I think that is a storytelling shorthand, right? That's like, well, yeah, and well, my other favorite illusion for that I tell my students is I love Thoreau's Walden, which is just a horrible thing they make high schoolers read because you're not prepared to read that in high school. But
you are the only human I've ever met who enjoys Walden.
Well, my favorite part about it is like it's deep and meditative, and it's just so long, and it's a chronicle of his first year living at Walden Pond. And he goes through, he measures the ice bubbles, and he talks about the wildlife and the flora and the fauna, and on and on and on. Then I think it's basically like the last line is like, And the second year was much the same. Like, it's like, it just, yada, yada, yada is the rest. And clearly, you can see that he put everything into the first year, and it didn't matter that it had to be separated into 2 years. And so there's a way in which the return narrative has always felt like that to me. It's like, yeah, and then we get back. Like, don't worry about it. It's fine. Yeah. But I understand what you're saying. And again, I'd go back to my opening metaphor, which is like each of those click, 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 like we are in for a pretty wild ride as all of this stay and where you're saying landmines, I think in my mind it's like more people following them. It's like, let's just add another group and another group and another group, and that's gonna and the party's growing too, which is just I in high school when my friends wanted to go to Six Flags, it's like, yeah, I'll go with the two of you, and it's like, well, but my little sister and her friend, oh, but my other friend and this friend, and it's like, we're going to be trying to move 10 people around an amusement park. Like, no, thanks. So I had that feeling as well. As the party continues to grow, it's like, guys, you got to split up into two groups, like send one group to the water park now, and the other go get your pizza or whatever.
I think going to the water park is what everyone in the Wheel of Time needs at the current moment. That was kind of what I had for this chapter. Was there anything else that you felt like we really needed to dive into?
No, I'm tapped. I'm excited. The next two chapters have tantalizing titles. So next episode we're doing 18 and 19. The Camelin
is how I've said it, but
Camelin
has not been said on the show.
Sure. Camelin Road, and then Shadows Waiting. And as I already alluded to, the image on the top of the next chapter is super enticing and intriguing. So I know we're going to start with that discussion. So make sure everybody checks out that for one of our ill-advised discussions of a visual object in a audio only format. But other than that, the standard outro will roll in a minute, but we continue to be super excited that this is underway and that people are shooting us questions and comments. So please use all of those methods. We will continue to get better at checking them and picking up on them. But, our goal for this podcast is just to make sure it's consistent, which is why we're working a little bit ahead. And while we sacrificed a little of the community building for that, we value that you want to go on this journey with us and commit your time and energy to it. We understand it's a voluntary homework. So as this journey continues, we'll just start to kind of work together in real time, but we'll continue to lay a bit of track ahead of this train for now. So thank you all, and we look forward to it. Tyler, a pleasure as always. I think we are finishing just after 9 p.m., which is exactly when you need to go to bed. So
I am a very old man. This is my bedtime. Although I think in an episode where we discuss how we're leaning into the trolley problem and running someone over, laying the track is an odd metaphor to be going with. That being said, we're so thrilled to have all of y'all along with us. Please continue spreading the word. Let everyone know how fantastic this podcast is, because we're awesome. And we look forward to seeing you next week in a very exciting episode of Through the Glass Columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.